Thank you, Susan. So Dyke Hendrickson lives in Newburyport, the birthplace of the U.S. Coast Guard. For many years, Dyke was the outreach historian for the Customs House Maritime Museum, and he authored the Nautical Newburyport, A History of Captains, Clipper Ships, and Coast Guard in 2017. In 2020, he wrote the New England Coast Guard stories, Remarkable Mariners, and just recently published a third of his Merrimack trilogy. Merrimack, the Resilient River, an illustrated profile of the most historic river in New England. And I think you sold just about every one tonight, Dyke, so I don't have one to hold up. Dyke is a graduate of Franklin and Marshall College with a degree in history. He did graduate work at the University of Maine in Orono. He has been a writer and editor with the Portland Press Herald, the New Orleans Times Picayune, and the Boston Herald. Other publications he has written for is USA Today, the Boston Globe, and a tennis magazine. You'll have to explain that when you get up to talk. Other publications, he has also been a waterfront reporter for the Daily News in the Newburyport. So please welcome Dyke Hendrickson. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joan. It's good to be here. I've spoken here in the past, and I see some friends here, and thank you for being here. I got started on this when I was at the Daily News, say in 2014, when the city of Newburyport had a big anniversary. I did a 25-part series on the city, and I learned, and many of us know, but I got into a little deeper about how remarkable the river was and is, how remarkable the ocean is. And since then, I've been doing books about the river and the maritime life. And when I started the Merrimack River book, I thought it was part history and part call to action, because the river is sometimes getting dirtier, not cleaner. Now that doesn't mean it's not clean right now, and we will go into some of the reasons why pollution can be very high. But I did want to say that if you're close to this issue at all, and many of you I'm sure are interested, a lot of work can be done to make the river cleaner and available to more people. Here's a shot of the Merrimack River. I'm always amazed that the Merrimack River and Newburyport was so prominent, and yet it's a very narrow opening to the harbor, as you can see, and it's a very shallow river. And so it took nevertheless, it was a great boat building community in the 18th and 19th centuries, and Samuel Eliot Morison, one of the great historians of the 20th century, actually said there was no community that built more ships or had more commerce than Newburyport, and that's quite amazing. So there are a couple shortcomings to the river. It's shallow, it's narrow, but one of the great advantages that the Merrimack River had was that it's 117 miles long. In other words, the shipbuilders could get plenty of lumber from upriver, and that isn't the same, you know, in Gloucester or Salem or other communities. They have rivers or tributaries, but 117 miles going into the deep woods of Massachusetts and New Hampshire was an enormous asset. And this slide also shows part of another asset of our region, which is the marsh. The marsh is an enormously valuable element to birds, to insects, to fish, and it's the largest north of New Jersey, I'm told. And so this shows part of it. The Parker River National Wildlife Refuge also has marsh assigned to it or aligned to it. So we have a lot of assets here in the river. The river starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. You can see it here. It comes south. The number 3 there is Lowell, and then it starts going east again. So 117 miles long. Some people, 2 years ago, there was a group of public officials who went the whole 117 miles. They were called the Voyagers, and we'll talk about them in a moment. Newburyport was a leading shipbuilding community in the colonies, and here you can see a remarkable painting done that reflects how large the vessels were and how significant they were, larger than some of the buildings. And so this was done by Richard Burke Jones. He is a city clerk here in town, but he's so much more than a city clerk, as you can see. And he does his history. He really puts things the way they were. And this is what Newburyport looked like in about 1850 or so. Here is one of the last tall ships built on the Merrimack in Newburyport, is the Symington. It was put together in about 1893. And you can see some of what a big day it was when a ship was just about finished and they put it off to sea. Now, the observant mariner would notice there are no masts on the vessel right now, but frequently they did that after it got out there. They would put it in the water, make sure that it was caulked correctly and that it was stable, and then put the masts on later. But look at how many people were actually there. In the foreground, women dressed up, school kids are there. There are a few horse and buggies, and it was just a great day. And one reason that the shipbuilding era ended in Newburyport was because the ships got large, but beyond that, they couldn't go out and bring cargo back. Remember, we said that the mouth of the river is quite shallow, depending on tide and time and that type of thing. But a vessel like this could not come back loaded with cargo. So that is also why Newburyport never really got into the age of steam, when they iron and steel boats and these steam vessels that plotted the Mississippi and other places. They could not get into the river because they were too heavy. Things started changing in about the 1820s. Upriver, the Pawtucket Falls in Lowell, became a center for the textile industry. And this was a time of great science advancement in hydropower. So scientists would learn how to dam the Merrimack, or they'd have locks, or they'd have different estuaries to hold water until they needed it. This was a new science, and it was really remarkable. And people say that the Merrimack in this area was like Silicon Valley is today, that they had great entrepreneurs, they had smart, energetic people, and in the 1820s and 1830s, some of the textile mills were among the largest in the country. Here is the Spigot River in Lawrence, which is a tributary to the Merrimack, and it's getting a little dirty here. Towards the end of the 19th century, pollution was significant. In those days, they would frequently just let out the dyes into the river, or let out the effluent from the mill. And so things became dirty, and quite a bit of a disaster. But on the other hand, the way I look at it, there's two sides to this story. The rivers did get dirty at the end of the 19th century, but it's applied so many jobs to people who are coming from across the ocean. The Irish famine in 1850, many people came to the North Shore to get jobs. The Jews were persecuted in Poland, in Russia, in many places. Armenians and Greeks were also persecuted. So when I think of the pollution, I also think that this was a place of great hope for people who came and worked in the mills. And maybe some of you people had family who started in the mills. But the river got dirty, that is true. But a lot of families started here and began lives in the New World with jobs in these factories. Here's a mill clock in Lawrence. It's still there. It was once the second largest in the world, next to Big Ben, it is said. And it was good for a lot of people, because probably the factory workers didn't have pocket watches or Rolexes in those days. Well, wait, I know they didn't have Rolexes. I'll just stick with the pocket watch. They didn't have pocket watches, I'm saying. But so you could see what time it was, you can make sure your shift was 10 minutes away, and you could get there okay. But that's still there, and a real icon in the area. Now, going upriver a little bit, when we say the Merrimack River can, get very active and violent, as it were, this is a fascinating photo, I feel. 1936, the river had a tremendous flooding several weeks of flooding, and you can see the Anaskeag manufacturing companies to the left, and that was among the largest in the world. Maybe not in 1936 because it was losing its space. Some places manufacturing was going south. There were unions coming in, making strife heavy. But the Anaskeag Manufacturing Company was one of the largest in the country. And here you can see just how powerful the river was. And it was a time, and this flood did not just come to the Merrimack. In Maine, the Androscoggin, the Kennebec, they flooded in a significant way. The Connecticut River flooded. It was a very difficult time for if you had work along the river. Here's a wonderful shot of the Merrimack meeting the ocean, and you can see a sandbar in the foreground there. And I always, as a reporter, I would do many stories about, hey, we've got a guy who's never been to Newburyport. He just bought his boat last week, and he's hung up on the sandbar. I mean, I can't tell you how many times this story came across the desk. And, you know, at first I thought, well, I'll go down and interview him. And then later I would think to myself, doesn't this guy read the literature? This is very hard to, you know, deal with if you don't know it. But even today, many people still get caught in the sandbar. This is Reservoir Terrace, which right now is going through a lot of erosion and a lot of difficult moments. But nevertheless, I think that's a wonderful picture of the river meeting the ocean. The Coast Guard has been a familiar asset to Newburyport for many years. It is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. Now, people frequently still say, well, I've heard that's true, but is it really true? So the answer as it to being true is it is true, because in 1789, Alexander Hamilton went to President Washington and he said, we don't have any money. Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury. And Washington, who could be droll at times, said, I know we don't have any money. Do you have any bright ideas? And so Hamilton said, yes, let's start a revenue cutter service. Vessels we will build. They'll go out, they'll stop smuggling, they'll go onto the big ships coming in and make sure they're paying their adequate amount of revenue. That was a very successful plan. And the first of these 10 vessels that Washington approved was built here in Newburyport, right in this area here. It was called the Massachusetts. So that is why, because Newburyport built the first revenue cutter, that is why Newburyport is considered the birthplace of the Coast Guard. And the other element to that is, people are always saying, well, could this be true? Actually, President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 signed a proclamation saying that Newburyport was the birthplace of the Coast Guard. I don't know what kind of in-house lobbying took place for Lyndon Johnson to say, where is Newburyport? And who else is up for this thing? But anyway, and that document is right here at the Maritime Museum. So yes, you can say, well, there's a document from Lyndon Johnson, and it was the first to be built here. I should say that the word Coast Guard didn't come into play until 1915. It was kind of the revenue cutter service and the revenue service, all permutations. But in 1915, the revenue cutter service merged with the other services, including the life-saving service. And the life-saving service was also started on the North Shore. So they got together in 1915, and in 1939, the two of them got together with the lighthouse service. So it was a moment over 20 years when three institutions came together, created the Coast Guard as we know it today. And so it's a very vibrant organization. I did write a book about it. It's been active in every war that we've had, even going back to the Civil War and beyond. So sometimes we see it as, you know, saving lives in this harbor, as they do frequently, but it is, you know, very valuable as an asset. And there's another thing I learned recently which fascinated me. The Coast Guard was in charge of trying to stop prohibition and rum running. Not an easy job if you think, you know, how many how many beaches there are here, how many inlets. But what they did was they were able to learn the codes of these rum runners. Even though these guys were Dems and Does guys, probably, they figured out what the Dems mean and the Dozes meaning, and the Coast Guard figured out the codes and the shorthand that they used on walkie-talkies. So in the 30s, so Prohibition ended, and then the 30s came along. It looked like we would have to have good code breakers against the Japanese and the Germans, so they went to the Coast Guard because they had cut their teeth on the mafia and all these rum runners. So it was just a very interesting moment. I'm sure these Navy admirals weren't too happy to go into the Coast Guard and say, guys, we need your help. We understand you can really do this well. Admirals don't do that very well, from my knowledge. But anyway, it worked out, and the Coast Guard has a lot going for it. Now, the Merrimack can get a little elements of pollution to it, but it's still a beautiful waterway. Here's a shot in Amesbury, and there's Maudley State Park across the way. And talking about being a writer committed to his goal, my daughter just got married in front of the Merrimack River 2 months ago, and so it was just a wonderful moment. The river's, going backwards and forwards, and so it was a beautiful day, and so that's, I guess, another reason why I'm committed to the Merrimack. Haverhill has made a great comeback in recent years. It was, up until 1972, quite polluted, but as you can see, they're making wonderful new developments. Some are condos and apartments, some of it's medical. There are also buildings. Lowell has some classes there, as does Northern Essex. So here the Merrimack is cleaner, and Haverhill is making a good comeback. In Lowell, one of the most interesting parks exists in the urban area, the National Park Service park there, and they will take you out on a vessel and show you the different locks and rivers and tributaries of the river. I don't think it's operating now because of COVID, but here, maybe next summer, you can look at it, and it's a wonderful trip up and down the river with knowledgeable guides. Here is the start of the Merrimack River in Franklin, New Hampshire, and it looks like it could have, been 4 or 5 centuries ago. It's just beautiful up there. The word Merrimack actually was a Native American term meaning place of fast-moving water. So this looks like it's fast-moving water, and it's in Franklin, New Hampshire. Though I was in Franklin, and I'm looking around for a big sign which says the Merrimack River starts here. I couldn't find one. So I did what I had to do as a reporter sleuth. I went into the local pizza joint. And I said, do you guys know where the river actually starts? So one guy says no, and the other guy says, why don't you go to the high school parking lot, walk out as far as you can in the lot, and turn your head to the left, and I think that's where it starts. So I did do that. I didn't fall into the water. I think I saw where the Winnipesaukee River meets with the Pemmy Stream in Franklin, New Hampshire. But if anyone's in PR or marketing here and wants to perhaps pitch them on doing a little more publicity about the fact that the Merrimack starts here, they might do that. It's beautiful up in New Hampshire, and I think this shows it. Here was a similar situation. I wanted to see where the Nashua meets the Merrimack, and here it is. A beautiful part of the river and a bucolic site. Like, people do canoeing and kayaking and many different sports along this area. As we said, Lowell has done a lot with the river. You can see some locks, some dams. That's Lowell off to the right. And although some of these cities are utilizing the river, but they're not cleaning their sewage very well, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But UMass Lowell is a big asset to that area. Here is a shot of Lowell, and there are a lot of activities. This is above the mills and whatever. There's some people fishing, you have someone jogging, there's some people walking their children. So it's really quite an asset for Lowell as well as other communities. And here's a place in Lowell, as in many communities, they're repurposing some of the buildings. There's some mills here still, but other their offices, there's health and whatever. And I thought, you know, as I look at this and other photos, I think, well, textiles must have been a big industry, but another huge industry must have been brick making. Brick making. How many bricks they must have made. If you've ever gone down 495 and looked off to the right and seen the Lawrence Mills, I mean, they go on forever. So I'm thinking, that must have been, in addition to textiles, there must have been a lot of bricks being made in those days. Here we are in Manchester, New Hampshire. Several dozen power companies, smaller ones, still get their power generated from the river, and they send it to homes. Also involving Back to the Future, the river is still used by many people for drinking water. In fact, more than 500,000 people in this area get their drinking water from the Merrimack River. And so that's another reason why, you know, everyone should be concerned about the cleanliness of the river. Now, that they do have good science for cleaning it, they do, but I'm just saying that I was surprised. I didn't know that many people. Now, Newburyport is not a community that gets it from the river. We have the Artichoke and a couple other streams, but 500,000 people. In Lawrence and Andover, North Andover, Lowell. Again, many of the communities have gotten improved over the years, and the big pivot in the health of the river occurred in 1972 with the passing of the Clean Water Act. Anyone you meet who's involved in this field will say that was the biggest thing that happened, because finally there were federal regulations and federal money coming down, and the river started getting cleaner. Now here's a group, a lively group that took off 2 summers ago. They were called the Voyagers. That's Jim Kelcourse, a state rep in the first kayak, and Lane Glenn is behind him. He's the president of Northern Essex Community College. And they started in Franklin, New Hampshire. I hope they found the beginning of the river, because I'm not sure even now that I found the beginning of the river. But let's say they did find the beginning of the river. They came all the way down. Took them 4 days and 4 nights. And they wanted to, you know, learn more about the river, but they also wanted to talk to the media and talk to public officials and say, look, this is really important. We've got to do more. We think we can get some federal money. So they did generate a lot of public relations and talk to many people about their goals. Here they are in a more quiet moment, and I think the night before they were supposed to leave, they learned for their last leg, they learned that the tide was coming in about 3 in the afternoon. So no one wants to be paddling against the tide coming in from the ocean when you're exhausted. So they got up at 6 o'clock that last morning and got going. Now, of course, they have the current behind them, but I assure you, they wanted to get there before the tide had changed. Now, here's one of, you know, the great photos, I think, of our community. And boating has increased a tremendous amount in recent years. I think you folks know that. Last year, there were 1,500 boats registered just on the Newburyport side with the harbor master. There were 500 boats registered in Amesbury, Salisbury, and other communities. So a cleaner river has brought boating back. And I just love this photo because, of course, you can see it out here. We can see it after at this presentation. But boating has definitely come back to the Merrimack. Here is a scenic view of town line of Amesbury and Merrimack. Now, sometimes people say, why is Merrimack, the town, spelled with a C, and Merrimack with the river is spelled with a K? So I, as an ascribing wordsmith, had to look into this. So what happened was, don't ask me how this happened, but I think it's called a Scrivener's error. The cartologists or people who made maps, they would do it themselves, but they wouldn't necessarily be in coordination with themselves. This was back a century or two ago. So they had different spellings. But in 1909, for whatever reason, it got to Beacon Hill, and Beacon Hill people said, you know, we're going to spell the river with a K. You guys go home. You know, you can still have your C for Merrimack Street, which is right out here, or Merrimack the town. But you'll see two spellings, but that again, governmental action, put a K on that. One of the most poignant of industries, or what happened to the industry is fishing. We only have about 6 to 10 boats out here, but a century or two ago, it was full of fishing vessels. And it was a major industry, of course. Some went for day trips, some went for 3 to 5 days. And it's sad that it's changed, and we know some of the reasons. Federal regulations was some of it. Foreign nations with these huge factory ships took a lot of fish away in the 70s and 80s. Japan and Russia and Norway. Anyway, there's not too much fishing, but one of the things that strikes me about the fishing industry over the last couple hundred years is how dangerous it was. I mean, small ships would not come back for any given reason. In fact, there's a memorial right behind you that has the names of seven fishermen who did not come back to port. They lost their lives out at sea, and they've done a beautiful job on improving it. And the other element I think about when I think about how dangerous fishing was in 1852, there was something called the Yankee Gale. Now, of course, there were fishing boats all the way from Hingham up to Bangor to, to Portland. Many boats were out, hundreds of boats were out. But a bad storm came up in the fall of 1852, and 92 boats did not come back. 92. 24 of those boats were from Newburyport. So you can imagine the emotional trauma of this whole thing. I mean, that's husbands and fathers and brothers, and it was just a tremendously bad thing. But this happened frequently. So I guess in one way, fishing did fade away, but there's a tremendous amount of tragedy, and we could talk about that for a long time. I think that the kayaking just got a little easier. That's Jim Kelcourt's a state rep in the stern, and Diana DiZoglio in the bow. Both of them have done a lot for the river. Diana DiZoglio, state senator from Methuen, got a bill passed creating the Merrimack River Commission that enables studies and science to go on. Kelcourt's has been helpful with a regulation that is requiring sewage treatment plants to tell people downriver when they've had a big discharge of sewage. And that hasn't actually come together yet. And I won't go into it, but it's not here yet, but sometime it will be here. The curious thing is sewage treatment plant managers are very professional. They're very good at what they do. They don't want to be letting the sewage out into the river, but that's just the science of it. What we have here is CSOs, which is combined sewage outage, combined sewage outage. And so the CSOs, what happens, the sewage goes into the sewage treatment plant, the runoff of the water from the towns go into it, like all the rain we got yesterday, and everything goes into the sewage treatment plant. It's not enough to absorb it, so they let everything go. They discharge everything. So there's raw sewage, tens of millions of gallons. I think 2 years ago they said that like 550 million gallons had gotten into the Merrimack River over a year's time. Now, there's a lot more volume in the river than that, but still, that's a very high number, and one we should all be concerned about, and we'll keep talking about that. Now, here's one of my heroes, Ellen Swallow Richards. She was involved as a scientist in drinking water. And if you're going into drinking water, it might be very appropriate to have a name of Ellen Swallow. And she married Professor Richards. So what happened in about 1890, she was the first woman graduate of MIT, and she actually kept going to MIT, had enough credits to get a graduate degree, but they didn't give it graduate degrees to women. So, but she, in about 1890, there was a typhoid outbreak in Lawrence, and it was clear that bad water could have a lot to do with it. So she was put on a state panel to try to find the answer to this, and she was really good at this. Now, several people have told me, yeah, but there were a lot of men on the committee. But when I see a woman of great gifts and great achievement, I always try to, get her out front, because she was really remarkable. And she's also known as the mother of home economics. She lived in Cambridge. She would go to apartments and talk to about a balanced diet or, cleaner kitchen or things like that. She also started a lunch program for destitute kids in Cambridge, and she was one of the first people in an organization called the AAUW, the American Association of University Women. So this woman was a complete firecracker, very, very capable, and did very good work against typhoid. Now, most of everything we know about a clean river here came through politics. I mean, science is a beautiful thing, but it takes money. Ed Muskie sponsored the Clean Water Act in 1972. This is from his early days. And Maine, as we say, had very dirty rivers. He was on the Androscoggin in Rumford, Maine, and worked very hard to get clean water. Here is Muskie. Some of you might remember he was the vice presidential candidate in '68. He did not win. And then he also tried to become the presidential candidate in '72, but he did not get it. But he, kept his nose to some of his favorite projects, and clean water was one of them. And here is Muskie. He had more than 30 public hearings all over the country to try to bring together people who wanted clean water, make them aware that it was going to cost money, but the federal government was going to be there. He did a terrific job. Another person who did a terrific job, and I did not know this until I started this, was George Mitchell. In 1987, President Reagan, for whatever reason, decided he didn't want any more federal money going to grants for sewage treatment plants. And so Mitchell, was a reasonable person, and he said, well, can you compromise with us? Can we have low interest loans? Can we pass low interest loans so that communities, can do it, at least borrow money at 1 or 2%, and they can at least get started. So Mitchell was successful in getting that along, and that act is still out there. And Laurie Trahan, a congresswoman from the Lowell area, and Seth Moulton from the North Shore, they're chasing that money right now. And there's also money from the Biden's infrastructure program that could come to the Merrimack River and improve the sewage treatment plants in Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill. I'm not just pointing a figure at them, but the EPA has said they're not in compliance, and you guys got to do something. Now here's another wonderful champion of this area. Paul Songus was a champion of Lowell and the Merrimack River. I love this shot. If you knew Paul and his wife later, it was a wonderful shot. And he wanted a cleaner river. He died, and then Nikki, his wife, actually became a congresswoman and just gave up the seat several terms ago. So here's Paul Songus, died at 56 in 1997. Here's his grave site adjacent to the Merrimack. And he's another great force in improvement to the Merrimack. Here's the Whittier Bridge. As a reporter, I remember it started out at $292 million. I've since seen it actually cost $330 million, but it's still standing. I mean, who am I going to worry about it? I live on Low Street. It's not going to fall on me. I'm just kidding. But it's a real asset to the North Shore. Now, when we talk about pollution and how things were, and how things got better. This is a very stark example. In fact, my book is titled Merrimack, the Resilient River, in part because it lived through days like this. Now, this is the Nashua River, which is a tributary of the Merrimack, so this went into the Merrimack. But as I understand it from old timers, frequently the Merrimack near Lowell and Lawrence would look like that. If they were using orange that day for orange clothing, you'd have an orange river, or purple or green. I mean, this was true. It's very troubling. But then you see on the right in 2012, years after the Clean Water Act, it's a much cleaner river. So, you know, when I saw this, I put the juxtaposition of these two images. I said, you know, that says a lot. It just tells us we have come a long way. Here is a challenge in the Merrimack River. This is not from a sewage treatment plant, by the way. This is from, you know, a open water from the town of Methuen. But you can see how, well, unkempt things get. There's some shopping carts there, and, you know, there are different people on the North Shore that actually do it on their own and pick junk out of the river. There's a fellow in the Haverhill, Lawrence area named Rocky Morrison who does this. He has a boat. He has 3 or 4 teenage acolytes, and they go down and they pick up beer cans, and they pick up. Except he's got to change his game plan a little bit, because he doesn't have an agency or a government behind him. So Rocky does great work, except would probably be better if he can align with someone and work with many communities at the same time. And here's, in good old Newburyport, this is a pipe that, again, catches surface water. But, you know, if it's been hard raining, there's going to be petroleum and gas and beer cans and who knows what. So I think Newburyport people will be trying to get rid of that. Here's a, you know, shows the beauty of the river in the Amesbury-Haverhill area, but it also underscores another challenge for this area, which is development. And I think here you can see a number of buildings and cul-de-sacs. And American Rivers, which is a nonprofit out of Washington, several years ago called the Merrimack one of the most vulnerable rivers in the country. Now, they weren't, they weren't just saying it's the Merrimack, because, you know, many rivers are like that, the Hudson, the Connecticut, but they said the Merrimack has 3 major problems. CSOs, which we discussed, that's the pollution going into the water. Development, where you're getting so many houses and new neighborhoods that you're taking away pasture, you're taking away woods. And the third was forever chemicals. As new companies come in, they put compounds into the water. And some of these compounds are very hard to break down. And some of them we don't even know exactly what they are. So, you know, the scientific wing working in the Merrimack River is saying we need to know what these businesses and industries are putting in the river, because some of this won't dissolve for 100 years, and we could probably do better. That said, I mean, the river's a beautiful thing, there it is, but there are challenges, and things seem to be getting a little better. The Merrimack can be beautiful. In fact, we can almost see this if we were a little farther away. This is a bridge at sunset, just beautiful. Here is Senator Diana DiZoglio, who, as I has created the Merrimack River Commission. I think she's leaving her position to run for state auditor, but she's been very helpful. Now, when you woke up this morning, I doubt if you thought you would be seeing a smiling face of Richard M. Nixon later in the day. But this is it. In about 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire. This is not, no one's making this up. This isn't alliteration. It was on the cover of Time magazine. The chemical factories upriver near the Cleveland area were putting so much effluent. I mean, really, everything was going into the river, and it caught fire. And people, just everybody was suddenly saying, what is going on? The rivers were clean 300 years ago, and this one's catching on fire. So Richard Nixon was president in 1970, and he became the point man to create the Environmental Protection Agency. There were several small agencies at the time, but he said, no, let's get a big EPA, we'll get more regulations, it'll be funded, and there we go. And so for a while, it was looking good. He got his name on it. John Mitchell, who's the Attorney General, you might remember him, I think he ended up in jail. But I'm not being prejudicial about party here. So you had these two guys as the leaders on paper of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. But 2 years later, when Muskie's 1972 Clean Water Act bill came up, Nixon vetoed it. Can you imagine that? A person who gave out press releases to say, I have just started the EPA, things are going to get better. And then a bill comes from a Democrat and he vetoes it. However, people got along better in those days, I've got to think, across the aisle. And the Clean Water Act of 1972 was passed over the veto. So that is really why we have a better life here, the Clean Water Act. And old-timers will tell you that things got better. We got better sewage treatment plants and more regulations. Now this is I wanted to just mention a couple other people. My next project is on Plum Island, and I wanted to share this information with you because I'm excited about the idea. Plum Island, of course, is nearby, and this woman helped preserve Plum Island, but not many people have ever heard of her or didn't know the fabulous work that she did. In about 1928, she was a wealthy birder from Stoneham, and she donated $25,000 to the Audubon Society so they could buy a lot of Plum Island, the southern end. Now at that time, there were all sorts of housing developments were planned and industrial uses, but because the Audubon Society had a plan, because they had this money, the bird people in the Audubon were able to buy most of the southern end of the island. And I think that's why it's turned into the Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. This is an asset. I mean, I think you all know that. But this is a woman who wanted to, do something for the birds, to save the animals. It actually took, till about 1946 for it to come together. But I consider her a very valuable person in terms of Plum Island. And here's just a few postcards I liked. In the old days, you could go sit on the dunes and you could have a picnic, and it was just fun. And this looks especially good to me. In the old days, you could take a trolley right from downtown Newburyport, take a picnic, you go out and picnic out there, and then you could go to the casino. There'd be dancing, there'd be cards. I mean, it just seems so interesting to me. And now, well, I won't go into my prejudice about getting towed from Plum Island every time I'm down. I won't say that. I'll try to be an objective historian. But it does seem to me that it used to be fun in the old days, and now it's very hard to even put your car down there and enjoy the beach for a day. And Sandy Beach on Plum Island is a beautiful spot. At low tide, you can just about get across the river to Ipswich. And so I'm going to have some photos about Plum Island in my next book. And here is the northern end of Plum Island. As you can see, it's quite built up. You have the jetties out there. The jetties actually started being built in about 1870. Not the same ones, of course, and the river's changed its course. But new jetties, which came in 2015, are not new. And so there's just, a shot of that. And I think if you're local and you read the papers, you're seeing that erosion is coming into areas that they weren't expecting it, basically, on Reservoir Terrace. And so some of the city, state, and federal leaders are trying to figure out how to stop that. But this is a beautiful shot. It shows, the glory of Plum Island and the jetties and the big Atlantic. So this is the end of my presentation. I want to thank you all for being here, and we had a beautiful night. If any of you have a question or a comment, Please make it, because, you know, as a journalist, I say to myself, I'm always trying to learn. So if I didn't get something right, or you might say, well, there's another aspect to what you talked about, I'd love to hear that too.
Does the Newburyport sewer treatment plant, which is pretty new,